Well, welcome to Subawards, how to navigate the grant subaward scene. As Lori said, I'm David Grange, and I work in the Office of Sponsored Research Services, working on pre-award. We do have Nick Rogers, who works in the Sponsored Research Services, and he works on post-awards. Once award is given, he'll take care of it from there, and you'll hear, he's not here today, but you'll hear from me a little bit about what he does. And as Lori said as well, if you can hold your questions or type them in the chat, then she'll wait till the very end and ask them all at once. I'll give you all a minute to read each slide before I present them. So I'll be quiet for a little bit and then I'll jump in. So a subaward is comprised of a recipient and a subrecipient, also known as a subawardee. And these definitions come from the Office of Management and Budget, which is a federal office. So it's not RIT just making up definitions. This is a governing body over all of universities and institutions involved with federal research. So as you, I'm sure, read, a subaward, an award given to a financial institution made by a federal entity or sponsor. Recipient would be, in our case, we're going to use RIT as the recipient, and a subawardee, in this case, we'll use U of R. So as an example, if RIT submits a proposal to the National Science Foundation and it gets awarded, yay! RIT is the recipient. In this proposal, the PI decided to work with U of R, and the third party would conduct a portion of that research. So U of R is the subrecipient. Now SRS is a post-award. SRS post-award will establish a subaward agreement with U of R. U of R does the work, provides the deliverables according to the contract, and U of R sends an invoice to RIT for their services. So essentially, in this case, RIT becomes NSF to the subrecipient in this case. The key takeaway from this is RIT is responsible for subaward spending. And as you can see at the bottom of the slide, you have the prime sponsor, which would be NSF or NIH, or whatever other agency, RIT, which would be the recipient, and then the subrecipient, which would be U of R or any other institution that we contracted to do the work. So differentiating between a subaward, a vendor, and a consultant can be pretty challenging. That's usually one of the questions we get the most from PIs, trying to figure out who they need to go with and how it financially affects their budget. As a PI, you need to decide what type of work or research needs to be done on the project and who is best equipped to perform this work. It may be a partnering university or institution, which in this case would be column 1, a subaward. It may also be a company who provides goods or services. This would be a vendor, column 2. And in column 3, it may be a consultant or a person. It can also be a consultant group, but they would generally have expertise in a specific area of research, and they'd be available, or they'd be able to provide the expert knowledge on your research and give you advice and guidance. Financially, a vendor will normally provide you a quote for the hourly rate of the goods or services that they'll provide. Depending on what it is, it may be a daily cost or it could be a cost per item. A consultant generally will provide knowledge and expertise in a specified area, so they will charge you a daily rate, or they may charge just a set fee for the entire program for that year. The method for pricing usually varies between the two. It really just depends on what type of research or work you're having performed. So It's not an exact science, but it's generally along those lines. Now, a subaward, which is what we really want to know about, is with a university or another institution. And they would have to fill out a budget. They would work with the PI, create a scope of work, and determine how much their costs will be, and they would get it approved in the budget beforehand during the whole proposal preparation process. Including several forms, documents that are usually required by a sponsoring agency. They'll need to send those in and touch that part next. Now, F&A is assessed on subawards each fiscal year. The pass-through entity or recipient only assesses F&A on the initial $25,000 of each subaward, regardless of whether it's 3-year, 4-year project. After F&A has been charged on $25,000 of each subaward, no more indirect costs are charged. I know Becca will go into this a little bit more in detail later on how it factors in once it's been awarded. But the key takeaway of this is we'll charge F&A on the first $25,000 of the full award. And the partnering institution, so U of R, will still charge their normal F&A on the subaward budget as well. So if you're not monitoring this closely, it can take a big chunk out of your budget. Like I said, this is available on the SRS website. It's a 5-page document, and most PIs have very little to do with this aspect of the proposal, other than pushing your partnering PI to get all his documents in before the deadline. A very important thing is to connect pre-award, myself, and the other institution's pre-award admin. As you can see on the 2 images, page 1 of the subrecipient commitment form, and on the far right is page 5, the last one. You'll want to notice section A, which is highlighted, a little hard to see, but this will list out all the documents that are required by the subaward institution. Generally, it'll be a statement of work, a budget, a justification, and depending on which mechanism or which agency you're funding or applying to, they might have a bio sketch or a current and pending, and that would be for each PI, co-PI, and senior personnel as well. And of course, they'll need to fill out and sign the subrecipient commitment form. On the last page, you'll see that highlighted section. This should have the institution's information. It'll include DUNS numbers and other information that as a PI you don't necessarily have to worry about, but we want to make sure it's correct and signed. So as a PI, you really should familiarize yourself with this form. And most institutions will have a form similar to this if RIT were to be the subawardee. So it's really good to make sure you're familiar with it and what are the details that go into this form. And lastly, please respect all university internal deadlines. This is whether we are the recipient or a subawardee. A lot of times we have to put all this paperwork together, and sometimes you need a couple days to get it done. So if another institution has a 5-day deadline, just like RIT does, you'll want to get that paperwork into them a little bit sooner, so they have a little bit more time before their deadline. Entering into a subaward, this is once it's been awarded. And now this process is normally done by our sponsored research services post-award, which is Nick Rogers. A subawardee institution must adhere to the same terms and conditions as the recipient or the prime award. And reporting functions typically go, or not typically, they always go through the recipient institution. Now, pass-through entities or awarding organizations may put additional terms and conditions on the subaward. Oftentimes, the reporting is due earlier than if it were to be straight to the prime award. Mainly, like I said earlier, we have to put those documents together and we need time ahead. So if you're a subawardee, you'll want to get your reports a good week in advance if you can, or even more. And like I said, most of the information on this page is completed by Nick Rogers behind the scenes. It's more procedural, but I wanted you to know what all happens and just to realize it takes time to put this all together. So 2 key takeaways for you from this page should be that as a PI, you need to monitor the subawardee performance and any financial issues, and report them to SRS post-award right away. The second takeaway is that subcontracts are done on a yearly basis. And sometimes might have performance or task modifications as well as financial changes. So a revised contract is done every year. From here, I'll open it up to Becca, where she can explain more about once it's awarded and how we report it.
Before I continue on with the actual presentation, I just wanted to once again introduce myself. My name is Becca Hyde. I am the SPA post-award financial rep for NTID. And what that means is I help PIs once they have an award, and I help them set up spending plans and help them put together projections over the years of their grant. I help them know what costs are allowable and what costs aren't allowable on their grants. So I just wanted to give you that background on myself one more time. It's a little bit hard over Zoom, not knowing who's here, so I just thought that would be helpful. And so just to kind of reiterate what David had mentioned earlier in the presentation, SRS sets up the subaward agreement template. That's the form that David showed earlier. And then they also will send the subawardee on the grant, they will send them a risk questionnaire. The risk questionnaire is really important if RIT is the recipient of the award from a federal institution or state institution. Even for private grants, it can be very important. Because RIT, being the recipient, has all the responsibilities associated with the subaward, we're in charge of monitoring their spending habits and making sure that they're in compliance with federal rules and regulations. So what RIT does is send them a risk assessment so we kind of know what we're getting ourselves into with dealing with another university. And it kind of helps us plan for the grant ahead. And then once we have the template filled out and the subaward questionnaire risk assessment approved, the PI will then approve the subawardee's budget justification and their scope of work. That way there's a contract set in place so that everyone knows what their roles and responsibilities are in terms of completing the objectives of the grant. So as I mentioned before, if RIT is the recipient of the award and we have a subawardee on the grant, we are still responsible for the subawardee's spending, and we're still responsible to make sure that they are in compliance with federal statutes and regulations. This is important because if a subawardee isn't following the right spending plan, they're not contributing to the scope of work, if they're allowing things on the grant that aren't allowable according to the federal government, it will actually show up as a red flag for RIT from the sponsor because RIT was supposed to be monitoring that subaward. So even though the occurrence happened at the other institution, it's still RIT's responsibility, and we'll still get in trouble from the federal government if something were to happen. And as David mentioned before, when we're looking at the grant's budget, only the first $25,000 is going to be assessed F&A. And when we say F&A, that means indirect costs. Those terms are interchangeable, so you'll hear them used in the same meaning. Basically, that is a set rate that RIT has where they charge grants for overhead. So they basically charge a small amount to the grant to be able to use RIT's resources like lights and electricity and things like that. So that's one negotiated rate, an indirect cost or F&A rate, just so everyone's on the same page with that definition. So when we're awarded a grant from a federal sponsor and RIT has a subaward on that grant, the first $25,000 of the subaward is an assessed F&A, that indirect cost rate. The rest of the grant is not charged that F&A rate, so you get the full amount to spend. And you'll see that broken up as a PI on the grant statements that RIT provides you from our Oracle system. You'll see that breakdown, and you'll be able to see how much you have left that will be assessed F&A, and you'll be able to see how much you have left that doesn't have F&A associated with it. So it's a pretty easy distinction to make, but it's just important to know that that is logistically how it will show up. This is just a simple checklist to kind of show the different roles in monitoring a subaward after it's been granted. So in SPA, we actually every month or every couple of months will get an invoice from the subaward showing their charges, how much they've spent that month, what they spent it on, and the dates that they incurred those charges. We'll review that for reasonableness, and if something looks strange or out of the ordinary, we'll ask for more documentation or question the other university and ask for more in-depth details about the charges. And then if we find that everything looks reasonable, we'll send it to the PI for approval. And then the PI's approval for these types of charges is really important in this case. The reason the PI's role in approving the invoices is so important is because they're really the ones who will know the true scope of work and what the subawardee should be working on. So when they look at the invoice, they should have a better idea if the charges on there seem reasonable, the amounts seem reasonable, and if the work is getting done in accordance with the objectives of the grant. If something looks unreasonable to the PI, they should go back and ask for more documentation or just a better explanation of the charges listed on the invoice. Once they are satisfied with the charges on the invoice and they know that everything looks in order, they will electronically sign it and approve that invoice. And then that lets RIT know that these charges are valid and it's okay to process a payment. So just to reiterate some more key points, the PI's responsibility is to approve the payments to the subrecipients and approve those invoices. Once they approve an invoice, they are also approving the work that is being done and is shown on the invoice. And again, as David mentioned, if they see something that looks wrong or they believe for whatever reason that the subrecipient isn't performing the work that was detailed in the contract in the scope of work, or they believe that maybe they're spending not in accordance with federal guidelines, then they need to immediately bring that to the attention of SRS or SPA so that we can get it dealt with and hopefully figured out. But if we don't know about it, then we can't help. So it's really important to bring that to the attention of your administrators. So I think we've given you a pretty good idea of what a subaward is and kind of what it looks like once you get one on a grant. But I also think it's really helpful to understand from PIs themselves, their experiences with subawards, what happens when you have a subaward on your grant, what happens when you are the subaward of another university, and hear from a PI's real-time experiences. So at this time, I'd like to turn it over to Peter Hauser, so he can talk about his experience with subawards. And then at the end, if anyone has any questions, we'll go over questions at that time.
So related to subawards, I have experienced being the sub awardee for many grants of mine. Many of my grants I've received have been through subawards, beginning in 2004. When I was a postdoc fellow at around 2004. I was a postdoc fellow from 2000 to 2002, and then after I finished my fellowship, I was still in partnership with my mentor, and we submitted a grant together. But my mentor already had a variety of publications and had received multiple research grants previously. But myself, I had just received my PhD in 2000. So when we submitted the grant together, U of R was the prime and the mentor was the PI. RIT was the subrecipient. I was the co-PI. And so the PI, or my mentor, my mentor, sorry, I see the interpreter, Nikki, who is voicing for me on FaceTime. She was moving her hands and she was distracting me. Stop. Okay. So we had the contract, and my contract had a percentage of my salary paid. And it equaled a course waiver at that time. I'm no longer teaching, but I did previously teach courses, and I got a course waiver so that I could focus more on my research and get RIT students involved in the research and use RIT money and resources for the work that we would be doing. So that was part of the contract. And then we sent the bill to the U of R, who then sent their invoice or their bill to NIH. I believe it was NIH. So that was the plan in 2004. We got the grant in 2005, and I then was involved in the VL2 Center at Gallaudet. That was a grant from the NSF and $5 million annual budget, a huge budget. And the individuals who worked on VL2 were not only from Gallaudet University, they were from other universities. So Gallaudet was the primary contract and grant recipient, but they had multiple sub-recipients to pay us for our faculty time and our students' work. So as a subcontractor, a sub-awardee, I'm not the primary PI, but instead part of a larger team. So I have since received my own grants, but I have continued working on grants where I am the sub-awardee, or RIT is the sub-awardee. So now our center has 4 subcontracts with several different universities who are the primary grant recipients. Some of you may be familiar with the Bridges program, the Rochester Bridges to the Doctorate program. It's a training program to increase the number of deaf and hard of hearing students going into PhD programs. The Bridges program is funded from the National Institutes of Health, and the primary grant recipient is the University of Rochester. So the funds go to the University of Rochester, and then we, RIT, as the sub-awardee, have a subcontract and receive funds from the U of R. So the University of Rochester is a research-intensive institute. They have many, many NIH-funded grants. So the grants primarily are often for research-intensive universities to partner with universities and colleges that serve primarily underrepresented minorities. For example, HBCUs, historically Black colleges and universities. I believe you know what I mean by that. So historically Hispanic-serving Hispanic-serving colleges and universities also. So there is a push for the research-intensive universities to be the primary awardees and then partner and subcontract with minority-serving universities. So many people wonder why you would want to do a subcontract, or another university might want to have a subcontract or sub-awardee. Often it may be, for example, they want a deaf researcher or deaf consultant. But now to do all the paperwork for a contract as a sub-award or sub-recipient is a lot more work than just bringing in one person to consult. That would be whereas if we were going to do testing at NTID, because we were looking at hearing universities, mainstream universities that don't have a lot of access to deaf and hard of hearing individuals. They might have some expertise that we don't have and experts we have, but they need expertise and experts from the sub-award university. So they might bring in someone for that.
Well, thank you, presenters. This was fabulous. We had a couple questions come in via the chat. Please continue to send questions there if you have any. The first question,
Lori, do you want people to turn on their camera if they have a question or no?
I'm requesting cameras to stay off just so we can keep the big image of the interpreter and use just the chat function.
Okay, sure.
Is that okay?
Yeah. Sure.
Okay. Regarding, Becca, I think this is for you, regarding the risk form, what risks were being referred to there?
Usually the risk would just cover anything like from an audit perspective, if they've ever had if the other university has ever had an audit finding related to grants and contracts, or if they have ever, been denied funding for whatever reason. It's usually related to auditing if they haven't been following federal guidelines or things like that, if they've ever had like a grant shut down. It's usually related to that, just so the university knows what kind of relationship is going to happen between RIT and the sub-awardee, or vice versa, if RIT is the one who has to fill out the risk assessment. I don't know if, Peter, you have anything to add?
I have never had any high-risk partnerships or collaborations that I could speak of. My collaborations are with universities who are quite experienced with subcontracts. I would suspect that if you were to do a subcontract with a university as the primary who doesn't have as much experience with subcontracts, then you may run a higher risk.
Okay, thank you. Next question. How is the PI really supposed to know the amount of effort that a subawardee has put into the project since they aren't monitoring hours? Becca, do you want to start with that?
Sure. So just by definition, effort is a reasonable assessment of time. Not everyone knows exactly how much somebody works on something unless they were with them, watching them 24/7. So effort in general is just a reasonable assessment of time spent on the project. So with a subawardee, it's all laid out in the budget and the budget justification, what the effort requirement is going to be. And just intuitively, you should be able to see how much effort they've put in terms of either deliverables on the project or work that's being done in general. If somebody's charging a really high effort, but you're seeing none of the deliverables being finished, or, they're not hitting any of those work benchmarks that you've laid out in the contract, then that would be an indicator that maybe something's wrong with the effort. But usually it's just a reasonable assessment of time, and you would know that by looking at the work that's been completed.
Next question. I'm going to see if David wants to start with this one. What is the takeaway point of noting the $25,000 limit on F&A on subawards?
So you need to, when you're budgeting out your expenses with your subaward, you need to take that into consideration if you have a limit for your budget. If you only have $400,000 for your budget and you're gonna give them a third of it, you need to at least plan for 125,000 plus F&A on that as well from their own institution. So you really need to understand the full cost of it.
I'll also just add something, Lori, before we move on to the next question. F&A and indirect costs in general, something to keep in mind is just spending power when you're talking about F&A. So that's something that automatically gets deducted. And when David was saying that F&A comes out of the first $25,000 of that money that you're giving to the subaward, that's just automatically coming out. So they can't actually spend that. So I think that's what he's saying to be just keeping in mind.
We had two similar questions come in, so I'm going to kind of merge them. This is directed towards Peter, and then David and Becca, if you want to add anything. Peter, what are the pros and cons of a subaward, having a subaward based on your experience? And what are some examples of why we should have a subaward with another institution?
Related to the pros and cons, in my mind, a whole list comes to mind actually, but if it is NTID trying to establish your own lab, suppose it's an NTID faculty wanting to establish your own lab, one way would be for you to apply for a grant, become a PI on your own, of your own grant. At that point, you are limited to the resources that you have immediately available within NTID RIT. Resources, including manpower, person power. So then, suppose you're wanting to research something in your field, and you're wanting to look at something specific within that field, and there's an expert that you want to partner with, but they are not within your institute, or maybe you need use of equipment that RIT and TID does not have, but you know a researcher or collaborator that does have that equipment. So collaborations make your research more strong, but it also expands your team and your network. Then also, you know, maybe if you're wanting to do some type of research within your lab, but again, you don't have the right type of resources, there may be a subcontract that you could receive. But then suppose I am working on a project and someone from a different university reaches out to me to work with them. I am not the PI, I'm not the lead of the team, but I am part of the team. So why would you want to be involved as a sub-awardee? Well, we will receive resources as a sub-awardee, being money, maybe course waivers, maybe more possibilities for publications, more funds to hire more students to work in my lab. As myself, as the PI, I'm responsible for everything. But if I am the sub-awardee recipient, then I have less responsibility as far as the grant at large. But then often it's good to have you as the primary awardee and then the sub-awards under your grant being you as the primary PI, and then also be a sub-awardee and be the co-PI. And now research does not happen without people. There are good co-author teams and good project teams that I've been involved with, and there have been some not so great co-author teams and not so great research team projects that I have been involved in. As far as the cons go, it's really you're building financial relationships with other institutions, and that can be sticky. But it is important for the institutions to invest in you and for you to invest in them. But if it doesn't feel like it's going to be beneficial for your work, think about why you would want to do it in the first place.
Any considerations to note for subawards with nonprofits that may not have people on staff like sponsored research services? So I think they're saying if their institution doesn't have, or industry or whatever have you, if they don't have a sponsored research department. Any considerations?
I think in that case, it would just be time. Myself, I can work with them or the PI there directly, and I don't mind doing that, but I would just need more time because they might need a little bit more explaining or hand-holding in that case.
From my perspective, usually I would just work with any sort of financial liaison. So sometimes that's just a financial analyst, not necessarily a sponsored program accounting person. So in that case, I would just work with any financial liaison they have to set up the invoicing and the billing and things like that. So it really wouldn't have an effect too much from that perspective. The only thing I can think of is if they don't have a specific department for sponsored research services or sponsored research accounting, they might not be as familiar with the nuances of, say, what's allowable on a grant as far as expenses and what's not allowed on a grant. So that might take a little bit more explanation from us to them, like David said, and just a little bit more time to explain those things. And it might result in them being a little bit higher of a risk when they fill out that risk assessment. But that's really the only thing I can think of that would be a little different.
I do just want to note something. This isn't a question. This is just me giving some more information that when you're thinking about your grant, program evaluation, statistical consultation are common things to outsource, but that's usually a consultant agreement. And I'm mentioning it because OADR is beginning to fund those consulting services. So if that's something to have in your proposal, it's definitely worth talking to Bob Pollard about, who is the one that also noted that. Bob sent me that message. Thank you, Bob. I don't have any more questions lined up right now for the team, but does anybody have any, as we wait to give a little more time, if people have questions, I want to see if any of the three of you have any other things you can think of that would be helpful to note at this time.
The only thing I'll say from a PI primetime perspective in general is that this is, as Lori mentioned, our first PI primetime via Zoom. So if everyone can just remember to fill out the evaluations at the end and give us some feedback, we would love to hear from you and how we can improve and make this better going forward, because it seems that for the foreseeable future, we will be communicating via Zoom. So I would really appreciate it if everyone could fill out the evaluations.
I'll add something for recipients and subawardees. NSF has had a lot of recent changes back in May, with new guidelines and new documents being required. So as whether you're RIT applying or you have a subaward, you want to make sure you read through all the requirements for that. And I'll help you through that as well. But especially with subawards, you want to stay on top of it and make sure any documents or templates that they need to be on are all included and you have it on your checklist. So it's just something that's come up more often, especially now with Corona. A lot of requirements are changing, so it's something to keep in mind.
Yeah, I would add, if any one of you attending, if you plan to have a subcontract or either be the recipient of or be the primary for a subcontract, please be in touch with me. I would be happy to share what an example of the scope of work, SOW, scope of work would look like, the biosketch, everything that might be involved in a proposal of that kind.
Thank you everybody for coming.